In his heyday, Cooder was by far the best slide guitarist in the world. Normally, such a statement would invite controversy, but for 3 decades, from the late 60s to the late 90s, Cooder really was head and shoulders above every other slide guitarist in the world. When Cooder was listed in 2003 at number 8 on the Rolling Stones list of 100 greatest guitarists of all time, above Jimmy Page, Keith Richards and Jeff Beck, nobody argued. Cooder is a master of both the acoustic and the electric guitar, and countless other stringed instruments. He has integrated many rock elements into his blues and folk-based playing, and his rhythm playing is distinctive as his soloing. Cooder possesses immaculate feel, timing and pitch, a wonderful sense of melody, and an amazing capacity to play the right notes at the right time. Notes that sound entirely natural and original, and that serve to enhance the music. The guitarist plays with his fingers and is also a master of the fingerstyle guitar, whether he plays with or without a slide. When playing slide, he alternates between playing with a bottleneck and fretting his left-hand fingers, giving him a huge variety of options. Someone wrote, perceptively, his bending and blending of notes can make the instrument sound like it's talking or crying or laughing. Cooder has a truly unique, instantly recognizable sound, and throughout his career, his guitar skills have been in huge demand. He was a guest performer on recordings by countless top artists, including the Rolling Stones, Van Morrison, Steve Vai, Eric Clapton, and many others. Cooder also wrote the soundtracks for 17 movies, some of which became legendary. He made pioneering and influential albums with musicians from India, Africa, Cuba, Hawaii, and Ireland. Most of all, he created a stunning oeuvre of 17 highly regarded solo albums that, taken together, can match that of any great A-list artist. For all these reasons, Cooder is sometimes simply called an American genius. He has been recognized with 6 Grammy Awards, honorary doctorates from Queen's University in Canada and the California Institute of Arts, and a BBC Lifetime Achievement Award. Cooder is 74 and has, in recent years, scaled down his activities. He has also, for most of the century, stepped back from his guitar hero role, focusing more on playing accompanying parts on albums he has released. But his playing continues to have an enormous influence on guitarists all over the world, while his solo albums remain treasure troves of outstanding music. It is why we are taking a closer look at the man and his career in this video. Ryland Peter Cooder was born on March the 15th, 1947 in Santa Monica, Los Angeles. His father, Bill Cooder, was a liberal lawyer and a folk singer, and his mother, Emma Casaroli, was of an Italian descent. An accident when he was only 3 years old shaped much of Cooder's life. He accidentally struck a knife in his left eye while trying to fix a toy car and spent a year in dark rooms and hospitals. His eye could not be saved, and he ended up with a glass eye. One night after the accident, while he was lying in his bed with the room darkened, a family friend entered and laid something on the boy's stomach. When the boy asked what it was, the friend replied, "It's a guitar." Playing the guitar became one of his main ways for the one-eyed young boy of expressing himself. The young Cooder practiced incessantly, initially playing the 4-string guitar given to him, and then a Martin guitar his father bought for him when he noticed his son's aptitude. He hated school, and playing guitar offered yet another refuge. Cooder became so good so quickly that his father reportedly quit playing guitar when his son was only 5, because Junior was already outplaying him. In his teenage years, Cooder spent a lot of time in the guitar shop on Pico Boulevard in Santa Monica called McCabe's, and at the Ash Grove, a local folk club. He would sit in the front row, closely watching the performers, who included John Fahey, Lightning Hopkins, Tom Paley, Doc Watson, Sleepy John Estes, and Reverend Gary Davis. In part inspired by his folk singer dad, the young Cooder practiced Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger songs, and he started playing the blues, picking up slide and finger-picking techniques from recordings by legendary players like Elmore James, Josh White, Son House, Blind Willie Johnson, Lightning Hopkins, Robert Johnson, and many others. Amazingly, a few years ago, a recording surfaced from 1963 of a 16-year-old Cooder accompanying singer Jackie DeShannon during a concert at the Ash Grove, playing traditional folk and blues songs. It's the first known recording featuring Cooder, and his feel is already recognizable even at this early stage. Around this time, Cooder also performed as part of a bluegrass trio with Bill Monroe and Doc Watson. It extended the instruments he played to banjo and led Cooder to add banjo tunings and the three-finger roll to his guitar techniques. By 1965, at the age of 17, Cooder had become a much sought-after local guitarist. In that year, he formed a group called Rising Suns with fellow guitarists Taj Mahal and Jesse Lee Kincaid, bassist Gary Marker, and drummer Ed Cassidy. They signed to Columbia Records and recorded one album, produced by Terry Melcher. It was not released until 1992 and called Rising Suns, featuring Taj Mahal and Ry Cooder, clearly piggybacking on the fame Mahal and Cooder by this time enjoyed. In 1967, Don Van Vliet, leader of Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band, asked Cooder to step in because the band's guitarist had suffered a nervous breakdown. Cooder featured on the band's debut album Safe as Milk in 1967, one notable contribution being his arrangement of the tune Grown So Ugly. However, at one point the band's original guitarist turned up with a loaded crossbow, and Cooder feared for his life. After more erratic behaviour, this time from Van Vliet himself, just before the band was scheduled to perform at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, Cooder quit the band. By this stage, Cooder was receiving regular calls to play as a session musician. He was still supposed to attend high school and was at one point called in to justify his absences. When he explained that he had made $5,000 per week for some sessions, the response was curt and to the point. Then, what are you still doing here? As part of his session career, Cooder played on recordings by Neil Young, The Monkees, and the Rolling Stones. He played mandolin on the Stones' cover of Robert Johnson's tune Love in Vain, which appeared on Let It Bleed in 1969. Apparently, he showed Keith Richards the open G tuning, which the Stones guitarist went on to use for much of his career. Cooder is also rumoured to be the originator of the riff for the single Honky Tonk Woman, although he's never been credited. There were more guest performances on albums by Randy Newman, 12 songs, Gordon Lightfoot, Little Feat's debut album, Judy Collins, Arlo Guthrie, the Everly Brothers, Stories We Could Tell, and so on. Cooder again worked with the Stones on Sticky Fingers in 1971, playing slide guitar on Sister Morphine. And in 1969, he took part in a studio jam with Mick Jagger, Charlie Watts, Bill Wyman, and pianist Nicky Hopkins. Produced by Glyn Johns, it was released in 1972 as the album Jamming with Edward. By 1970, being a session musician stopped being Cooder's main focus. Producer Lenny Waronker judged that Cooder could be a successful solo artist, and he signed to Warner's Reprise label. His first album, produced by Waronker and Van Dyke Parks, is simply called Ry Cooder, and was released by the end of the year. The album is in many ways a blueprint for many of Cooder's solo career. It contains mostly older blues, folk, rock and roll, and pop songs by the likes of Woody Guthrie, Blind Blake, and Blind Willie Johnson, played by an eclectic collection of session musicians, including pianist Van Dyke Parks, bassist Chris Etheridge, and drummers Milt Holland and Richie Hayward. Keeping the disparate elements on the album together were Cooder's inimitable guitar playing and his voice, which was not attractive by traditional standards, but suited the music, and most of all, was full of swagger and attitude. Cooder had unearthed several forgotten gems from the past, just like he would do for most of his solo career. One example is How Can a Poor Man Stand Such Times and Live by Alfred Reed, first recorded in 1929. It has since Cooder's discovery been covered by the likes of Bruce Springsteen, UB40, Joe Bonamassa, and the song was added to the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2020.
There's no sense in shooting a man till he shows fight.
Ry Cooder's second album, a masterpiece, Into the Purple Valley, released in 1972, was built on similar principles. The focus this time was on protest songs from the 1930s Dust Bowl era, set in unusual arrangements based on blues, calypso, folk, gospel, rock, and country. It features a song by Bahamian guitarist Joseph Spence, who would become a major influence on Cooder. The album was called A Tour de Force, and his playing phenomenal. It was regarded as his commercial breakthrough, even if sales continued to be relatively low. Cooder's third solo album, Boomer's Story, was called an archaeological dig through American folk and blues music, and saw him work for the first time with drummer Jim Keltner, who became one of America's top session drummers, and continued playing with Cooder for decades. The album's standout track is The Dark End of the Street, a soul song from 1967, written by Dan Penn and Chips Moman. It became a staple of Cooder's live performances. Paradise and Lunch in 1974 was next. It combines forgotten songs from the past with contemporary material by Bobby Womack and Burt Bacharach. It also features horn and string arrangements, and for the first time, extensive backing vocals, which became a defining feature of Cooder's solo music. Cooder showed a penchant for picking songs with amusing lyrics and titles, like Married Man's a Fool, If Wolves Could Talk, and Ditty Way Ditty. The album also contains the traditional Jesus on the Main Line, which also became part of Cooder's regular live repertoire.
I know Jesus is on that main line. Tell him what you want.
Chickenskin Music, released in 1976, saw Cooder blend Tex-Mex and Hawaiian music with Latin, blues, folk, jazz, and gospel. It marks the first time he played with accordionist Flaco Jimenez. Cooder himself played banjo sexto, mandola, bottleneck guitar, French accordion, electric guitar, slack key guitar, tipple, and Hawaiian guitar. His solo cover of Bourgeois Blues, a Lead Belly protest song from 1937 about discrimination and segregation, is an album highlight.
Home of the brave, land of the free. I don't want to be mistreated by no bourgeoisie, Lord, in a bourgeois town.
Showtime in 1977 was Cooder's first live album, recorded at the Great American Music Hall in San Francisco at the end of 1976, with a live band that featured Flaco Jimenez and regular backing vocalists Bobby King and Terry Evans. Cooder's acoustic guitar playing on Jesus on the Main Line is amazing, as is his solo on The Dark End of the Street, which is sung by his backing vocalists. Cooder's playing on the entire album is spectacular, with not only outstanding slide solos, but also stunning rhythm playing that sets the entire band alight. Jazz, released in 1978, is arguably Cooder's most ambitious and strangest album, as he set out to recreate jazz music from the early 20th century with Dixieland, ragtime, vaudeville, and Tin Pan Alley elements. Cooder even uses a big band on some tracks. The album features music by Jelly Roll Morton, Bix Beiderbecke, and Joseph Spence. And one of the highlights is Nobody, a song from 1905 with a wonderful fretted guitar solo. Cooder plays masterful acoustic guitar throughout the arguably flawed but very enjoyable album.
I ain't never done nothing to nobody.
By this stage, some storm clouds were gathering over Cooder's career. Jazz was received with reservations by critics because they felt Cooder had followed old arrangements too closely. Cooder himself in a 1983 interview called the album a stupid, pompous, horrible thing, a wretched mistake. In retrospect, that seems a bit harsh. Although Cooder's work before jazz had been highly and universally acclaimed, and he was at the peak of his powers as a guitarist, singer and producer, his records still did not sell particularly well. There was also his 1976 tour, which had resulted in Showtime, but ended in catastrophe. Cooder recalled in an interview from 1981 that band members' relatives were dying, musicians were falling ill, and he added, "We had a bus we couldn't pay for, so we lost it and we had to drive cars, which would break down in the snow. I was sick for 2 years after that, exhausted, debilitated, demoralized. I believed in it and I thought it was going to happen. It was so great. Who could not like it? But it turned out that very few people did like it. Those were dark days." A change of direction was needed, and this arrived with his next album, Bop Till You Drop. Released in 1979, it's an almost entirely electric affair, with rhythm and blues, soul, and rock and roll songs from the 50s and the 60s. It sounded more current and suitable for mass consumption, with covers of songs made famous by the likes of Elvis Presley and Ike and Tina Turner. The album also was the first ever major label release recorded to digital. A 3M multi-track machine at Warner Brothers recording studios in North Hollywood. Legendary engineer Lee Hirschberg was behind the controls. He had worked with Cooder on several albums and suggested that the, at the time, groundbreaking move to all digital. In an interview in Billboard soon after the album's release, Cooder said, "No one knew what would happen, but the difference was incredible over the big studio speakers. And once we heard it, there was no question. It's very dramatic, especially on drums, because of the peaks, lows and highs. For guitars, you get this real finger chord skin sound. On vocals, you can really hear the edge. I'll never go back to 24 analog again." Cooder also mentioned that the tape recorder occasionally ate an entire drum part, in an early indication of some early digital pitfalls. Perhaps he was slightly blinded by the novelty of digital, because he did record to analog again. And over the years, the album has received criticism for sounding sterile and lifeless. However, today the album still sounds fresh and clear, and far better than many digital records made soon afterwards. Despite of, or perhaps because of, Cooder trying to be more accessible, Bop Till You Drop contains some of his greatest work. From his cover of Presley's Little Sister, to the gorgeous lilting guitars in the instrumental, I Think It's Going to Work Out Fine. Most outstanding is another prize winner in the great titles category, The Very Thing That Makes You Rich Will Make Me Poor, which apparently was written by an unknown Memphis taxi driver who Cooder had met by accident. It became one of the defining songs of Cooder's solo career.
I'd rather climb up into the bed with a rattlesnake.
Bop Till You Drop indeed turned out to be more commercially successful, and Little Sister was a minor hit. Cooder redid the entire exercise with his next album, Borderline, in 1980, which again mined 1950s and 60s rhythm and blues and rock and roll territory, with some reggae and Tex-Mex influences thrown in. Borderline also saw him work with guitarist and singer John Hyatt for the first time. However, the 3M digital sound on Borderline was tinny, and the choice of songs was not as inspired. The album nevertheless contained another Cooder live classic and great title contender, Crazy Bout an Automobile, Every Woman I Know, as well as the wonderful Why Don't You Try Me Tonight.
Crazy about an automobile. All right.
In an interview in 1981, Cooder commented on what could be called the pop phase of his career. Promoters don't book you because they like you. They do it because there's good business to be done. Bop Till You Drop pulled me out of a weird hole. It's crazy to make records nobody buys. It's just a waste of time. Once you make a decision to cut a record, you figure that there's a public gesture and you want to get the record out there. With Bop, I finally did that. It sold about 300,000 copies, which is 6 times what the rest of them have ever sold. It was just in the nick of time too. Warner Brothers had a big blackboard and an eraser, and a lot of names were suddenly disappearing. Cooder was at the top of his game in many respects, and by now enjoyed worldwide guitar legend status. In an interview around this time, he explained that he possessed 50 guitars. Some of the main acoustic guitars he uses are a Gibson Roy Smeck from the 1930s, a 1950s Martin 0018, a Gibson SJ200, a Takamine J15E, a K Craft, a Kona Hawaiian guitar, a Voss flat-top cutaway that has been turned into a Mando guitar, and a 1930s Gibson Mastertone banjo. Cooder's electrics in those years included a 1967 Daphne Blue Fender Stratocaster, tuned in open D and nicknamed Coodercaster. It was sold in 2020 with an asking price of $150,000. He also plays a 1960s Strat tuned in G, a Gretsch 6120, a 1960s Gaiatone LG 200T, a 1949 Gibson ES9, a Ripley stereo guitar, and a K semi-acoustic from the same year. Cooder uses amps by Fender, Standell, Dumble, Hiwatt, and others. He plays with a variety of open guitar tunings and has gone on record stating that he does not like the sound of new strings, and so he tries to change the strings as rarely as he can. In the early 1980s, things were seemingly going well with Cooder's career, but inwardly he was struggling with the role of frontman and guitar hero and the pressures of commercial success. He was wildly popular in several European countries, for example, selling out the Hammersmith Odeon in London 8 nights in a row. And I went, and it was amazing. But when he returned to the US, he was barely able to make a living. Cooder recorded 2 more solo albums as a leader during the 1980s. The Slide Area in 1982, which he tried his hand at writing more of the songs, with uneven results, and Get Rhythm in 1987, on which he had a heavily distorted electric guitar sound. The latter album contains 3 of his best ever recordings: his amazing version of Johnny Cash's Get Rhythm, his equally impressive and very funny all-acoustic cover of Chuck Berry's 13-question Method, and the masterful Across the Borderline, which he co-wrote with John Hyatt and Jim Dickinson. The latter song contains one of the most soaring and evocative slide guitar solos. But as time went on, the pressures of his artist, frontman, guitar hero role and the difficulties of making a living from it became too much. Cooder would not release a solo album for 18 years. For unknown reasons, he even refused to give permission for the release of an astonishingly good registration of a concert in Santa Cruz in 1987 by filmmaker Les Blank, called Ry Cooder and the Moolah Banda Rhythm Aces. Let's Have a Ball. It was broadcast abroad on TV a few times and the audio on FM radio, but it has since only been available as a bootleg. Years later, Cooder explained, "I gave up on pop music. As far as the commercial entity, as far as pop music goes, I quit. I absolutely threw in the towel. I couldn't handle it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be what they need you to be. The record thing drove me insane. I couldn't figure it out. I finally had to stop making these darn solo records because they just didn't happen. Something was missing, and commercially it was useless anyway, pretty much non-viable. For most of the 80s, 90s and 2000s, Cooder's career would therefore consist of a zigzag course in which he tried his hand at anything but being the frontman and guitar hero. Part of his focus was on creating soundtracks for movies, which he said made him far more money. His soundtrack career had started in 1970 with 3 tracks for the movie Performance, which starred Mick Jagger. His next ventures were soundtracks for 4 movies by director Walter Hill: The Long Riders in 1980, Southern Comfort in 1981, The Border in 1982, and Streets of Fire in 1984. His soundtrack for The Long Riders is regarded as a masterpiece that can be listened to by itself and stands up to his best solo work. In 1985, Cooder finally achieved household name fame with his haunting score for Wim Wenders' road movie Paris, Texas. As the main characters travel through the American Southwest, with the movie following them at a very slow pace, Cooder's sparse, ambient acoustic slide playing evokes the grandeur and stillness of the epic landscapes on the screen. The film and the soundtrack were huge critical and commercial successes.
So it's a journey in this guy's mind, and the story develops from that, and that's what needs accompaniment. And especially because he doesn't talk. So you figure, well, if he doesn't talk, does he hear anything? And if he were to convert that into sound or melody, this is what it is. And you take the little theme, and each time it's a little more or it's a little different, and the slightest little nuance is going to push it this way or that way. And Harry Dean's all on his face. He's not using his voice for the first half, so you don't have that to consider. The audience has to somehow go with his pace and other things other than direct information like speaking.
Cooder's most striking next movie project was his score for Walter Hill's Crossroads in 1986, with the title and significant elements of the movie inspired by the story of Robert Johnson. Cooder played all parts performed by the movie's main character, Ralph Macchio, most famously in the guitar duel with Steve Vai. Only Macchio's super-fast Bach-like inspired arpeggios toward the very end were performed by Vai. Cooder never was a guitar player who went for virtuosity or great speed. Over the next years, Cooder wrote the soundtrack to another 8 movies, most notably Walter Hill's Geronimo and American Legend in 1993, and Wim Wenders' The End of Violence in 1997. There's also guest performances on albums by Van Morrison, Into the Music in 1979, Eric Clapton, Money and Cigarettes in 1983, John Hyatt, Bring the Family in 1987, masterpiece, John Lee Hooker, Mr. Lucky, 1991, another great one, Aaron Neville, Warm Your Heart in 91, and many, many more. 1988 brought Cooder his first Grammy Award, ironically not for his stellar solo career, but in the Best Recording for Children category, for his music accompanying the storybook classic Pecker's Bill, narrated by Robin Williams. Cooder did briefly try to resurrect his guitar slinger career with the supergroup Little Village in 1992, together with John Hyatt, bassist Nick Lowe, and Jim Keltner. However, their self-titled debut album was not well received, and the project folded. For the most part, Cooder's 90s were taken up with 3 major collaborative projects, with each more influential and high profile than the former. The first was A Meeting by the River, released in 1993, which features Cooder on acoustic guitar and Vishwa Mohan Bhatt playing a Mohan Veena, which is an arch-top Hawaiian guitar modified for use in Indian music with 20 strings. In 4 instrumental tracks, they are accompanied by Sukhvinder Singh Namdhari on tabla and Cooder's son Joachim on doumbek. The music is more or less a jam, which took place in Christ the King Chapel, St. Anthony's Seminary in Santa Barbara. It was recorded by Kavichandran Alexander Water Lily Acoustics label owner with all analog equipment, a lot of it designed and made by Tim Paravicini of Esoteric Audio Research. The album struck a chord and was exceptionally well received. It earned Cooder and Bart Grammy Awards for Best World Music Album and is still regarded as a world music classic. A year later, Cooder collaborated with legendary Malayan guitarist Ali Farka Toure on Talking Timbuktu. Other musicians included Clarence Gatemouth Brown on electric guitar and viola, John Patitucci on bass, and again Jim Keltner on drums. In addition to his usual acoustic and electric guitars, Cooder plays an array of instruments, including electric mando guitar, a large 8-string mandolin, an acoustic toy guitar, marimba, mandolin, kumbas, a Moroccan banjo, and tambora, an Indian sitar-like instrument. Talking Timbuktu is full of rolling rhythms and intricate guitar work, informed by American folk and blues and Toure's Malayan music. Cooder remarked, "The Africans don't have the melancholy blues, not even in their bluesier bits. Ali's blues is different in feel than American blues, but it's still got that expressive mode between major and minor that comes from the blues. The stuff we call blues has been around for a long time." Talking Timbuktu was also a critical and commercial success, and again earned Cooder a Grammy for Best World Music Album. Cooder also collaborated extensively with fellow guitarist David Lindley, and in 1995 with the Chieftains on their album The Long Black Veil. But his most attention-grabbing and earth-moving project was Buena Vista Social Club, which put Cuban music on the world map. The album was a result of a chance encounter with mostly elderly musicians when Cooder visited Cuba in 1997, breaking the US trade and travel embargo. The recordings took place over 6 days at Havana's EGREM studios, which still looked exactly as it had done in the 1950s. Buena Vista Social Club in 1997 contained traditional Cuban music, mostly in the trova and fill-in genres, enhanced with a sympathetic modern production by Cooder, who also played guitar. It became a major hit, selling over 8 million copies worldwide, and received countless accolades, including the 1998 Grammy Award for Best Traditional Tropical Latin Album. The musicians involved, including Cooder, went on a short world tour in 1998, which was immortalized by Wim Wenders in a movie that is also called Buena Vista Social Club. Cooder's collaborations after these 3 major successes were far lower in profile. Among them were Hollow Bamboo in 2000 with trumpeter John Hassel and flautist Ronald Majumdar, and Mambo Sinuendo 2003 with Cuba guitarist Manuel Galban, which later earned him yet another Grammy Award for Best Pop Instrumental Album. Cooder also produced several records for Cuban singer Ibrahim Ferrer, who had found fame through Buena Vista Social Club. One of them, Buenos Hermanos, in 2003, earned Cooder his 6th Grammy for Best Traditional Tropical Latin Album. Finally, in 2005, Cooder took the solo album plunge again with Chavez Ravine. It was a concept album about a Mexican-American Los Angeles neighborhood that was destroyed after shady deals with developers. Musically, it harks back to his earlier solo albums with a mixture of Mexican, Cuban, Latin, and traditional American influences. 3 things are different, though. There are several featured singers, and when he does sing, Cooder uses a different, gentler voice without his earlier swagger. There's also hardly any guitar solos. Chavez Ravine was well received, and Cooder released another 4 solo albums. My Name is Buddy, 2007, I, Flathead, 2008, Pull Up Some Dust and Sit Down, 2011, and Election Special in 2012. These 4 albums cover social, political topics, with most or all tracks written by Cooder, and the music is mostly in a faux folk style. The albums again were critically acclaimed, but less commercially successful. Perhaps the absence of significant guitar solos diminished their appeal with fans. Cooder has worked closely with his drummer son Joachim since the 1980s, and there have been stories that Joachim encouraged his father to resurrect his classic music from his 70s and 80s solo records and play solos again. Whether or not it was due to Joachim or not, Cooder fans were happily surprised by the great man going on tour again, playing some of his older music. This was documented on a live album credited to Ry Cooder and Corridos Famosos, called Live at the Great American Music Hall, San Francisco, August the 31st to September the 1st, 2011. In the same setting as Cooder's 1977 Showtime album, and with two musicians who were present at the time, accordionist Flaco Jimenez and vocalist Terry Evans, Cooder revives the good old days with spirited renditions of old favourites like Crazy Bout an Automobile, Every Woman I Know, Why Don't You Try Me, and The Dark End of the Street. Cooder Jr. did play a part in convincing his father to make another studio album again, more along the same lines as his 70s and 80s solo albums. The result was Cooder's most recent solo album, The Prodigal Son, which again contains blues, country, and folk tunes from the earlier part of the 20th century, and contains more featured guitar playing than Cooder's other 21st century solo albums. Whether Cooder's career has come full circle or whether he has more pioneering projects in him remains to be seen. But with 17 solo albums, more than 20 collaborative albums, 17 soundtrack albums, and countless guest performances on record, there is an extraordinary amount of music to explore for any of you who are not familiar with his work. All I can say is I've seen Ry Cooder live, and it is a spiritual experience. I was blessed growing up in a house of classical music, jazz, and some blues, that I did know a lot of the blues artists that Ry Cooder was inspired by. But when I discovered Ry Cooder, and it was Into the Purple Valley and Bop Till You Drop were like the two big ones for me, when I discovered those albums, I was able to go back and find out even more. And the great thing about Ry Cooder is he doesn't just introduce you. I mean, obviously on Bop Till You Drop, you've got Little Sister, the big Elvis Presley. You've got some of the more mainstream stuff. But if you go through Ry Cooder's catalogue, I mean, to say that he was a tastemaker, or it would be an understatement. He, as you heard me talk about, he took songs from the turn of the last century and brought them into the mainstream. And then they ended up being covered by huge rock bands like UB40 or big stars like Bruce Springsteen and now Joe Bonamassa. This is a big deal. Ry Cooder, I mean, he's a national treasure. For the Americans watching this, I mean, he is so important to modern music. I feel like he, at times, kept that kind of guitar playing alive in America. It was so unfortunate in the 80s. Everything was all shredfest. And that's fine, don't get me wrong. But anything that Ry Cooder played on was just a breath of fresh air, because he's not about virtuosity and shredding. He's about feel and emotion and melody, and just one of the most beautiful guitar players that ever lived. And I love the fact that he makes top 10s in greatest guitar players all the time, by all over the place, because people realize just how important he is. But I think beyond his incredible guitar playing, songwriting, singing, production, all of that stuff, is the fact that he's the gateway to so many great musicians. Kids today can discover Ry Cooder and then look and be like, who are all these players? Who are these covers of? Who are these artists? And then just open up an incredible world of music, of American music, for over 100 years. Ry Cooder, thank you so much for doing that. I got almost teary-eyed talking about this. Such an important musician, such an important guitar player, and it is fantastic. Without Ry Cooder, many, many, many people would never discover some of the greatest music ever made. Thanks ever so much for watching. Please give us any comments and questions below. I would love to know other artists you'd love for us to talk about. Thank you ever so much, Paul Tingen, for working on this, because I know Paul is a huge Ry Cooder fan. So when he brought up doing Ry Cooder to me, I was like, let's do it. There is probably very, very few guitar players that you can speak so lyrically about. And, oh, God. Paris, Texas. Go put on the album Paris, Texas now. I remember buying it when it came out. I get teary-eyed just remembering. All my hairs are standing on end. Look at that. Was that being coming up in the light? Just thinking about that album. Go and listen to Paris, Texas. I implore you now. Thanks. So long. Farewell. Auf Wiedersehen. Au revoir. Goodbye.